Hello students. Within this chapter we'll be discussing the whole concept of productivity and growth. And basically what we'll be discussing are the various factors that cause an economy to grow over time. First and foremost, in order for us to understand the whole concept, we're going to discuss what's termed the standard of living. And basically when we speak of the standard of living, we're basically making an assessment of the amount of goods and services available on average per person. Normally within an economy, that average level of goods per person is normally used by way of us calculating what is called the GDP per capita. And basically that is your GDP divided by your total population. When we speak of growth in the macroeconomy, an economy basically grows over the long run because of several factors. And as you'll see from our first slide, these factors include increases in the amount and quality of resources, especially labor and capital. So when we speak of improvement in labor, particularly, we're talking about persons equipping themselves with some form of skills. Capital, on the other hand, we're talking about machinery. So as machinery improves over time, as the capital stock improve over time, these will all contribute to an economy growing over the long run. The other one speaks to better technology. So that is understandable. As technology advances, as the way people are able to do things change, then obviously that will lead to more output in the long run. A simple example, for instance, could be, let's say, traditionally you were using a calculator. Alright, you're using a calculator for your accounting. You will have seen, for instance, with the advent of a computer, in terms of the amount of data that you're able to crunch, that computer would have allowed you to do a higher, greater capacity in comparison to if you're using a calculator, a basic handheld calculator. The next one speaks to improvements in the rules of the game that facilitate production and exchange. Tax laws, if you have a very transparent democracy where the tax laws are pretty much clear-cut, these will lead to an improvement over the long run. Property rights is very important because at the end of the day, if for instance you're in the whole process of research and development, you want to make sure that after you have spent time going about coming up with some form of, let's say, a cure, it could be a cure for an ailment, you want to make sure that there's some property rights laws are in place, patent laws, for instance, are in place to ensure that after you have spent, for instance, 6 years, 10 years, as the case may be, developing some form of technique, you're guaranteed some form of productive capacity by way of patent laws and property rights, because you don't want to have a situation that after you have developed these sort of techniques or whatever the case may be, someone automatically comes into the market after you have brought your goods to the market and basically copy what you would have done after you have spent time and resources in coming up with these techniques. The other one speaks to legal system, and one of the things you just want to ensure is that your legal system is transparent. The advent of corruption is not evidence, whereby if, for instance, you are in the manufacturing process and you find yourself before a court of law, for instance, there is due process. So you expect there to be transparency within your legal system. If these are in place, then eventually you're saying that all of these various factors can contribute to an economy growing over the long run. So basically when we speak to economic growth, if we move to our next slide, we're saying that an economy can basically grow because of increases in your labor supply. So if your labor supply increases, it means then that more persons are able to produce additional goods and services, as the case may be. Secondly, we're talking about growth in the capital stock. And again, we're talking about machinery and equipment that are available to bring some form of goods and services to the market. If your capital stock grows, it means then that your productive capacity is also going to grow. The next one speaks to improvement in technology, and we have already addressed that. And the long and short of it is that within the core concept of understanding how an economy grows, we have what's called our production possibility frontier, and it's going to be coming up in our next slide. And just to introduce what we're saying here is that when technology improves, it's going to basically expand that production possibility frontier, making more efficient uses of existing resources. Again, improvement in the rules of the game will also facilitate economic growth in the long run. So what is that production possibility frontier? And as you'll see from our next slide, that production possibility frontier in a two-sector model economy, it basically shows you how much goods and services an economy can produce given its existing resources. So that arch within that frontier basically showed you that if, for instance, an economy is producing grain and wine, how much can it produce? So within that arc, anywhere along that arc, an economy is said to be producing its goods and services efficiently. So let's look at, for instance, way 12. You see where it has that point? What it's saying to you is that if an economy is producing and all the resources are operating optimally, 12 grain will allow it to also produce 9 wine. Alright? If it wants to produce 12 wine within that same vein, if it's operating efficiently, that will allow it to produce 9 grain. So within that frontier, we are exposed to the concept of what's called your opportunity cost. And those of you who would have done microeconomics would have been exposed to that concept of opportunity cost, which basically is your next best alternative. And since we're saying that we're dealing with an efficient stage of production, anywhere along that frontier, we're going to be experiencing that concept of economic cost, where it would then explain how much grain you'll have to give up in order to produce X amount of additional wine. Alright, so the way how this module is set up, if we start at 12 and you want to produce, let's say you're moving 12 grain, 9 wine. If you want to produce 12 more wine, you have to then give up 3 grain. That's basically what the frontier is saying. Alright, so let me understand and explain to you even further these 2 points you see within our frontier, points A and point B. Point A basically showing you a situation whereby an economy is producing below its productive capacity, because remember we're saying that any point along the arc represents an efficient frontier. So anywhere to the left of that quadrant is said to be attainable, but basically the economy is producing less than its optimum. And you tend to find this to take place during a recession, a depression, as the case may be, because during a recession, an economy is not producing at its optimum. Some resources are idle. So this is where point A basically comes into play. With regard to point B, however, these are the points that you normally seek to attain during an economy growing over time. So as an economy grow over time, because of the factors we have already explained, point B are the ones that we try to achieve, where that quadrant then is going to be pushed outwards. Okay, so point B within this current structure, it doesn't represent an efficient use of resources, because it can only be attained really and truly if you have economic growth. Okay, so again, if an economy has its resources, only along the arc would be an efficient use of resources. So let's look at the whole situation in terms of capital and how it would have impacted an economy growing over time. And what we're saying to you is that if you have a situation whereby an economy can produce consumer goods and capital goods, if it chooses, for instance, point A, where it's actually producing more consumer goods and less capital goods in relative terms, what we're saying to you is that to the extent that you're not really producing a lot of capital goods, which can then be used in the production process to get additional goods in the next year, as the case may be, an economy which produces more consumer goods and less capital goods will grow less in the next time period in comparison to, let's say, where we have point B in that other frontier, where the economy is producing more capital goods and less consumer goods. Higher growth is going to be achieved. Okay, so the long and short of it is that if an economy produces more consumer goods, it will not grow as much as if it were a case where an economy is spending more on the production of capital goods. All right, so an economy that invests more in capital, you're giving up more consumer goods, it will experience larger economic growth in the long term. So in order for us to again understand further the whole concept of productivity and growth, the question that comes to bear on our next slide is what is productivity? And productivity basically is what? Production, as we know, is a process that transforms resources into products. And within that, then we have the whole concept of productivity, which is the ratio of a specific measure of output, such as real GDP, to a measure of input. And basically, when we speak of productivity, we're seeking to measure how efficiently resources are employed. And the long and short of it is that the higher the productivity, the more goods and services that can be produced from a given amount of resources, and the farther amount will be that production possibility frontier shifting. So the long and short of it is that total output divided by the amount of a particular kind of resources employed is called productivity. Individually, we also have our productivity. We work 8 hours a day. How much do we produce relative to that 8 hour would then determine how productive we are within our job environment. So let's go now to the next slide, where we have what's called labor productivity. How efficient is labor in the scheme of things vis-a-vis output? And the first bullet basically says to you that output per unit of labor and measure total output divided by the hours of labor employed to produce that output gives a measure of productivity. And the most commonly used resources to measure productivity when we look at labor is that productivity and labor basically accounts for a relatively larger share of the cost of production, and it is more easily measured than other input, because at the end of the day you can then easily measure how many persons are employed. So that's why he's saying to you that the most commonly used resources to measure productivity is that of labor, because the statistics can be more readily available. We'll take a break and we'll start our next recording